It's really a great honor to be joined by Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, one of the most important figures in the study of Eastern European Jewish culture, among other things. She is Ronald S. Lauder Chief Curator of the Core Exhibition at the POLIN Museum in Warsaw and Professor Emerita of Performance Studies at New York University. She is the epitome of the interdisciplinary scholar, and her contributions have been felt in so many corners of the academic world, the museum world, the folklore world, and elsewhere. Certainly her 1977 book, Image Before My Eyes, this is a later edition, was one of the first books I ever owned on Eastern European Jewry and made an indelible impact on me. Other books that she's written or co-written include Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums, and Heritage, They Called Me Mayor July, Painted Memories of a Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust. This was with her father, Mayor Kirshenblatt, Zichrono Livrocha. The Art of Being Jewish in Modern Times, and Anne Frank Unbound, Media Imagination Memory, with the aforementioned Jeffrey Chandler. She has received many honors, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Foundation for Jewish Culture and honorary doctorates from the Jewish Theological Seminary and the University of Haifa. She serves on the advisory boards of YIVO, the Council of American Jewish Museums, Jewish Museum Vienna, Jewish Museum Berlin, and the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow. And she's an advisor to many additional museums. We're especially happy that she'll be discussing cookbooks because, well, we are a library. And I think that cookbooks, in spite of their important role in Jewish life, often get neglected when it comes to how Jewish books are considered. So it's my great, great pleasure to turn it over to Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett.
Well, thank you very, very much for that lovely introduction, Howard. And I want to thank you and Noah Albaum and Rose Katz, all of you, for hosting me today. It's my great pleasure to present Jewish cookbooks, but actually specifically Yiddish cookbooks. And what better context than a Jewish community library, which, as I understand it, is today really a rarity, and particularly one that is open to the public. So I want to begin by telling you that I'm an inveterate collector, and that as time has gone on, I have, in a sense, focused my collecting efforts. I was collecting rubber stamps, collecting all kinds of things, stamps as well. I decided to collect cookbook. I didn't really decide to collect cookbook. I would say that I accumulated them. And then when I realized that actually there's a difference between accumulating and collecting, and as I became more interested in them as cultural objects, as extraordinary, I would call them really a literary genre, especially and in large measure because they were written by and for women, not entirely, but largely. So, but as a collector, I just wanted to share with you, because I found it today, my very, very first cookbook, Homemaking and Meals. This was the textbook, I think from grade 5 in my primary school for my home economics class. And that home economics class was really, I would say, an expression of my interest in food and also cookbooks from childhood, from primary school. And my collecting began by getting free cookbooks from all kinds of product companies. Here's one of the ones that I collected as a child, from the Monarch Pastry Company. So the idea was that I could clip the coupon, not coupons, but these little squares at the, usually the bottom right corner of an advertisement for flour, for oil, for whatever it might be, and I could get a free cookbook. And I actually began by collecting product cookbooks. But as time went on, I realized that when I started to really not accumulate, but collect, I realized that I couldn't just collect broadly, I had to focus. So I thought, well, I'm working on East European Jewish culture. I'm interested in all things Jewish. I'll collect Jewish cookbooks. But that turned out to be enormous also, absolutely vast. And I was a graduate student. I had absolutely no money. So I thought, well, if that's so big, maybe I'll focus it even more, and I'll focus it on Yiddish cookbooks, because how many could there be? And if something comes on the market or I find something, well, whatever little bit of money I have, I'll put it into Yiddish cookbooks. And so that's what I did. And then, of course, as time went on and I was able to, I collected Jewish cookbooks more widely. So my cookbook collection now is more than, I would say, between 6,000 and 7,000 volumes. And my Jewish cookbook collection is more than 1,000 volumes. And my Yiddish cookbook collection is quite small because not many Yiddish cookbooks, relative to other Jewish cookbooks, not many Yiddish cookbooks were actually published. but I want to share with you those that were published, and I want to place them within a history of Jewish cookbooks because I want to understand why, well, first of all, Yiddish cookbooks, the appearance of them as publications is quite late. Jewish cookbooks were published, when you look at European cookbooks, Jewish cookbooks were quite late and Yiddish cookbooks were the latest of all. So I want to understand what's that about, and I want to really treat them as a literary genre. I want to treat them in relationship to who published them, who were they for? In other words, what I call the implied reader. We don't know, we know very little about who actually cooked from them, although I have one very interesting case that I want to share with you. But we do know who the author or the publisher intended the book for, and also the publishers are very interesting too. So let me start just by giving you a very quick sense of where these Yiddish cookbooks fit within a history of Jewish cookbooks. The first known, I should say this, the earliest Jewish cookbooks I've ever seen were in fact in Yiddish, but they were manuscript cookbooks, and they're in the collection of the Jewish Museum in Prague. I thought they were late 18th century. They're probably early 19th century. And there were, I think, 2 or 3 of them, and they're very similar to each other. So I have the impression, and they're in Yiddish, and they're handwritten, and I have the impression that they were probably used as, in quotation marks, textbooks for cooking classes, probably for young brides or for their servants. That is to say, the women that would be cooking for them. So, but they're not published, and they're not precisely dated. But if we turn to the published cookbooks, the first published cookbook, which I find quite extraordinary, these 19th century ones, is 1815, and it was published by Joseph Stolz. And who was this Joseph Stolz? He was actually he was Catholic, he wasn't Jewish. He was the personal chef of the Grand Duke in the state of Baden. Now, how does the Catholic chef of the Grand Duke in the state of Baden come to write a Jewish cookbook? How does that happen? Well, he explains it. He says, as far as I know, no similar book of this kind has been available for the followers of the Mosaic faith. He's being very polite because not in German, not in Polish, not in French, they don't want to say Jew. So they say of the Mosaic faith, Israelite, anything except Juif, Jude, Jid, etc. So you'll hear this language all the way through. As far as I know, no similar book of this kind has been available for the followers of the Mosaic faith. And for this reason, and for trying to be useful to many, I gladly acquiesced to the frequently repeated invitation of educated Jews and decided to let my manuscript be printed. Now, how is it that these educated Jews usually means that they are very German, basically. I mean, they're very acculturated. So how is it that educated Jews are repeatedly inviting him to publish his manuscript? What is this manuscript? So then he explains, and which I just was astonished when I read his introduction. As much as possible, constantly wishing to perfect myself in my trade, I gladly used the opportunity offered to observe the art of cooking in the houses of the most educated local Jews. So he's been invited by these local Jews, this great chef. Obviously, they had social aspirations. They had, to be bourgeois, to present themselves in a way that would be recognizable to their German peers. So he says, and after becoming thoroughly familiar with its practice, I decided to improve certain things in the Jews' method of cooking. The parts of dishes and ingredients which don't conform to the Mosaic laws or only at certain times, I substituted with other kinds so that the whole dish should be not only healthy and pleasing to the digestive organs, but at the same time, it should also conform in matters of taste to the requirements of the finer art of cooking. So this is the first. This is 1815, Joseph Stolz. And incidentally, a year later, he publishes a cookbook for Germans, in other words, in German, not for Jews, with the same recipes plus a whole lot more. So this is really quite extraordinary. But what it does is it inaugurates what I would call the 19th century European Jewish cookbook. And the 19th century European Jewish cookbook is above all what I like to call kosher gourmet. And that is to say that it is an attempt, basically, well, not on his part, but certainly some of the other authors. For example, Rebecca Wolf, and you can, I think, see probably from the cover, she, I would say, would be part of a circle that was very eager to provide socially aspiring Jewish women with a way to create gourmet, elegant European cuisine without violating the rules of kashrut. So there was an anxiety. I mean, I would say that, in the case of Stoltz, he's really exceptional. But in the case of Rebecca Wolf and those who preceded and followed her, there was an anxiety that in their attempt, in their process of embourgeoisement, in their process of developing the social and cultural competencies that would place them in a kind of a bourgeois milieu, that they might be tempted to violate the rules of kashrut. So this is what I call kosher gourmet. And in that regard, the only thing Jewish about it is that it's kosher. The cuisine itself is cosmopolitan. It's French, German, Italian, continental. It's European. And then in some cases, there might be a small section at the back for, quote, Easter dishes, meaning Passover. But that isn't the point. The point is that the women who would buy these cookbooks or use them to supervise their cooks don't need instructions how to make, quote, Jewish food. What they need is precisely this gourmet cooking that is kosher. Now, what I find very, very interesting is that, and this Rebecca Wolf, her Cookbook for Israelite Frauen, her cookbook for Israelite women, which means, of course, Jewish women, it was translated. It was translated into Dutch, it was translated into Polish, but it was, to my knowledge, it was never translated into Yiddish. And I find that amazing because when it appears in translation, it appears in a Polish translation. And the Polish translation, it appears, I think, in 1877, and again from a later edition of her cookbook, because she kept on adding to it in 1904. And so, in other words, and what's fascinating is, if you think about it, 1877, the majority of Jews in Poland are speaking Yiddish, not Polish. So this doesn't have a big market, but it had apparently, and there was enough interest that they reprinted it, or not really reprinted, they retranslated it, or they produced a new edition from a later edition of hers in 1904. So here you've got a Jewish cookbook in German, several actually, and this one. Now, what I find really, really fascinating is that not long after Stoltz published his, there were one or two others, but what I find especially interesting is something called a Hebrew letter cookbook, meaning that it looks like that cookbook is in German, but it's in Hebrew letters. Now, what is that? There's only one. I've never seen in the entire history of Jewish cookbooks. And at first I thought to myself, it's a Yiddish cookbook, right? But no, and it raises such an interesting question. So it's 1854, and the English translation of the title, like it's Neues vollständiges Kochbuch für die jiddische Küche, ein unentbehrliches Handbuch für jiddische Frauen und Tochter, nebst Vorschrift von Fleisch koscher machen und Challe nehmen überhaupt über Reinlichkeit und Kashrut. So it's a new and complete cookbook of the Jewish cuisine, or the Jewish kitchen, an indispensable handbook for Jewish women and daughters with instructions for koshering meat and separating challah, as well as for general cleanliness and kashrut, 78 pages, which is the smallest of them. So what is this? Why is it? Basically, it really, let me put it this way. Jeffrey Chandler, that you're going to be listening to, and you have to sign up for his lecture. He is brilliant. And his book, Yiddish Biography, is a wonderful, wonderful book. So I brought this to him. I said to him, what do you make of this? he said, well, in a German-speaking environment, and this is from Hungary. This particular cookbook was actually published by M.E. Levy's and Sons, and it was published in Pest. So basically Budapest, but in Pest. So, and it was published by the publisher. There's no author. So clearly the publisher thought there would be a market for this. And why? I thought to myself, but there's kind of a, well, okay, what did Jeffrey say? He said like this. He said, in a German-speaking environment, the boundaries between languages is blurred. And that is to say, we think languages have strict boundaries, that there's a boundary around what's Yiddish, what's not Yiddish, and that there's a boundary of what's German, what's not German. But in a situation where there are two languages that are very close to each other, like German and Yiddish, the boundaries are fluid. And you can have people that are actually fluent in both, but they may only be literate in one. So for example, a maid or a cook in a Jewish household may be absolutely fine speaking German, speaking Yiddish, reading Yiddish, but not reading German. So therefore, a German cookbook in Hebrew letters would be perfect. Now, of course, this cookbook wasn't published in very many numbers. Only one copy has survived, and it never came out in a second edition. So, but it for me is absolutely a fascinating case, and very much I would say, in the Western Yiddish region, and it's very different from the situation in Eastern Europe. So let me turn now to the earliest published cookbooks in Yiddish, because they are of a completely, well, I shouldn't say they're of a completely different order, but let me go one by one, and then I want to focus on two that I think are just absolutely fascinating. So the first one that I'm aware of is by Oisher Blaustein. And he lived between 1840 and 1898. And actually, his cookbook was published at the very end of his life. He actually published his in 1896 in Vilna, 1898 in New York. Now, I don't own a copy, but there is, but it has been digitized. And the Yiddish Book Center, if you want to see it, you want to look at it, you can find it in their digital library. It is really an absolutely fascinating cookbook, and also it is a case of, I would say there are a couple of these very entrepreneurial in the Yiddish orbit in Europe and in the United States writers who will write anything. So in the case of Blaustein, he's a writer of romantic novels. He's a translator. He published dictionaries. He published grammars of Russian, Yiddish, and Hebrew. And he also published this cookbook. Clearly, he's not a cookbook writer. I mean, Rebecca Wolf, that beautiful, kosher gourmet cookbook that was the most popular of all the Jewish cookbooks published in the 19th century. It was by far a bestseller and came out in, I think, 14 editions. This guy, he publishes one in Vilna and New York. And I'm thinking to myself, what Jews are in New York in 1898? This is the period of mass emigration. They're coming in droves from Eastern Europe. They are Yiddish-speaking Jews. And these Yiddish-speaking Jews, very often, they've left Europe in the 1880s and 1890s and in the years before World War I because of the wave of pogroms in the Russian Empire, and because of, after those pogroms in 1880, 81, then there were these May laws, these draconian laws, and the Jews were pauperized. Their economic situation was dire. And the biggest impetus for leaving was economic. So you have them, and Hasia Diner has written about this. She calls it hungering for America. So you have these impoverished Jews who manage somehow or other to get their tickets and get on a boat and come to America and go to the Lower East Side or wherever else they go. And can you tell me what they're going to be doing with this cookbook in 1898? I have zero idea. Vilna is another story, I would say. So, but in any event, so Blaustein is not a cookbook writer. He writes everything. But in this cookbook, what I find most interesting about it is that, and I'll tell you, it's a gold mine if anybody's interested in language. He gives the Yiddish name of the dish, then he gives the name in Russian and also in German, not always in both Russian and German, but certainly in German, and quite often, or more or less in Russian and German, which means that you could form a dictionary of terminology for these dishes just from what he provides in the cookbook. Now, his is a kosher gourmet cookbook. It really is. It's got lots and lots of recipes. It's huge in terms of the recipes that it provides. Let me just see if I can give you a little bit more information about it, because I think it's really quite extraordinary. So it has 216 pages, 668 recipes. Can you tell me what immigrant woman living on the Lower East Side needs 668 recipes? And especially in this very elegant, very, very elegant cuisine. And it includes strudels and compotes and kissel. So it's actually quite, I would say, more kind of coming from a Russian direction, but it's still kosher gourmet. And its implied reader, I would say that it is a case, and I think these Yiddish cookbooks, many of them are a kind of mismatch between the cookbook and its implied reader. And in this case, these immigrant women, I cannot imagine how they would be able to afford to buy it to start with, and that they would be cooking from it. So, but that nonetheless, so now what does he say? What did he think? Who did he think it was for? And why did he think, how was he pitching it? How was he selling it? Here's what he says. He offers several scenarios in which his cookbook could be useful. He says, the elegant young woman who is too busy studying, sewing, and knitting to learn how to cook or how to instruct her servant properly. Does that sound like immigrant Jewish women on the Lower East Side? I don't think so. So maybe in Vilna, in Poland, in the part of the Pale of Settlement, if they were living in big cities, Vilna. In Vilna, elegant young women who are too busy studying, sewing, and knitting to learn how to cook or how to instruct her servant. Your immigrant Jewish women on the Lower East Side don't have any servants. Or another scenario, the inexperienced servant who needed guidance. Another scenario, the experienced housewife searching for new and unusual delicacies. While educated readers, so basically, while an educated reader, and he says this, while educated readers could of course read cookbooks in other languages, those books did not address the specific needs of the Jewish reader. But in fact, many did, including the ones that he actually purloined, because he didn't write these recipes. He took these recipes from other books. So it's, I find it really, I really find it extraordinary. Okay, now to one of my star cases. Oh, and I should say that, to one of my star cases. So let me start with gastronomie juive, cuisine et pâtisserie. This is a little French cookbook, that is to say, Jewish cookbook in French, and it represents a completely different genre. So it's published in 1929. It came out in one edition, but only recently, I would say in the last, let's see the date on this one. In 1968, there was a reprint. So, and I collect all editions. It doesn't matter how many editions I have. So I collect all the editions. Okay. So it comes out in 1929, and it is of a completely different order. Why? Because although it says kosher, you'll see it's in Hebrew letters. It means that anybody who reads French but not Hebrew doesn't say for Jewish women, for the Israelite women, for the Israelite kitchen, kosher, kosher, kosher. No, it doesn't say that at all. What it does say is, it says gastronomie juive, cuisine et pâtisserie de Russie, d'Alsace, de Roumanie et d'Orient, which means basically Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, etc. So what is the genre? The genre is nostalgia. Nostalgia for the Jewish kitchen that was lost as Jewish women went the gourmet route. So this is it, and the introduction to it has nothing to do with keeping a kosher kitchen. It is a kind of nostalgic, and she herself was writing poetry, plays, romantic novels. This and the author is Suzanne Ruchamovsky, but I think her maiden name was Bloch. So this one is, it starts with little David, and it's probably a village in Galicia, and it's about he was the smartest kid in his cheder, and then it's about cooking in the kitchen with his mother-in-law, or his new wife and her mother, and the dishes are all what you think of as, quote, Jewish dishes. So now, what does she say? How does she characterize? How does she explain why she wrote this cookbook? In other words, how does she pitch it? And compare this with the oyster Blostein. She says like this. She celebrates what she calls la cuisine maternelle. In other words, mother's cooking. And she says, quote, the reader does not have to search here for quasi-pharmaceutical complications of a cuisine that is too modern, nor the royal luxury of truffles, foie gras, and champagne that one freely adds to all sauces, at least in the books. Instead, she says, expect a simple cuisine, home cooking. So that's basically her explanation of what she's after. So she's saying, enough with this gourmet stuff, and now let's go back to basics. Let's go back to mother's cooking. And so what are the recipes? Let me give you a little bit of a sense of what's actually in here. So cold beet borscht, chav, tomato borscht, cabbage borscht, pickles, gefilte fish, with instructions. Buy a live carp, and then there are instructions for how to kill it. Picha, chunt, tsimis, lokshen, farfel, mandlin, kreplach, knedlach, halkalach, pierogi, latkes, varenikis, kugel, teglach, homentaschen, raisin wine, povedel. So all like classic Jewish dishes. And if I'm not mistaken, the first recipe in here, which I found to be very strange, let me just get to it. Yes, believe it or not, the first recipe is called soup with hard-boiled eggs in salt water. In other words, it's from Pesach, it's from the Seder. Why would you begin this cookbook with hard-boiled eggs in salt water? I have absolutely zero idea. But nonetheless, so it suggests she never wrote another cookbook. Clearly, cookbooks were not her métier, but rather her métier was basically literature. That's basically what she was. That's what she was about. So, why is that cookbook interesting? Well, I came across a Yiddish cookbook by Beis Shafran, Die Jiddische Koch in alle Länder. And in the Polish title that's provided by the publisher, it's Kuchnia Żydowska. So basically it means Jewish cooking. It appeared in 1930 in Warsaw, Farlag Gastronomia in 1930. And you can have a look at the image of how they envision the implied reader. Now, I was looking at this cookbook and I said to myself, there is something very, very familiar about it. Very familiar. I said, I think I've seen this somewhere before. And sure enough, because it had some of the same illustrations, and then also even the title, Die Jiddische Koch in alle Länder, Polen, Russland, Rumänien, Deutschland, Elsass, Morocco, Tunis, America, and so weiter. So I look further and I say, oh my God, this is a pirated Yiddish translation of the French cookbook. Astonishing. So who's it for? So clearly the Gastronomie Juive is nostalgic, and it would be intended, I would say, for, in other words, by 1929, it was safe to be nostalgic, because by 1929, the project of acculturation, the project of embourgeoisement was, if not complete, there was no, there was, it was no longer an issue. In the 19th century, it was an issue, but by 1929, it's not an issue. By 1929, you can say, what price did we pay to move in these bourgeois circles? What did we give up? What did we lose? So this is positively ethnographic, but in a nostalgic register. What is this? What is the Yiddish Koch? And to my way of thinking, this is as much of a mismatch as was Blaustein. So this one, let me see if I can find for you what, yeah. So this one, I just found this astonishing. So the introduction, this is how we know who he thought he was writing or creating this cookbook for. He starts by admonishing Polonized Jewish women. Now, Rechomovsky doesn't admonish anybody. She creates a kind of pastoral of like shtetl life, of a kind of golden era, a golden age that has passed and for which we long. He, on the other hand, admonishes Polonized Jewish women. How dare they turn the health of their families over to servants rather than pursue the culinary arts themselves? Christian women, he pointed out, are more attentive to the care of their families. And then he writes a word to our Jewish wives. And he reports a conversation he ostensibly overheard between two Jewish young ladies. And I think he made it up. I'm sure he made it up. But here's the conversation. Quote, "You have absolutely no idea, Sabina," explained one to the other with a certain pride, "how much I hate the kitchen, how much I can't stand it. So much so that I never set foot in it. Kill me if I know how to cook a little cereal or a pot of potatoes." "And you think I am better?" answered the koleżanka, which of course, like not her chaverta, which would be a Yiddish word for friend, girlfriend, but using the Polish word koleżanka, coquettishly. "A month ago, my Leon had terrible stomach problems. The doctor ordered him on a diet, and he had to have kleikis, he had to have porridge or gruel prepared for him. Just his luck. The servant also fell ill, and I, let it never be said, had to be the cook myself. No, don't ask what kind of kleikis I cooked." So Saffron goes on to explain. "Outside of Poland, a girl gets a diploma in public school and takes examinations in the culinary arts. And so it should be among us." And he offered his cookbook as a step in that direction, notwithstanding its focus on down-home cooking and the inclusion of North African cuisines. So what was he thinking? Why would you address these Polonized Jewish women in Yiddish? I have absolutely no idea. It makes no sense. And why would you insult them in your introduction and then deliver to them a cuisine that they'll never make? They are a good candidate for the Polish translation. They're a good candidate for Rebecca Wolf's Kuchnia Kosherna. They're a good candidate for this, even if who knows if they keep kosher, but this is their cuisine, not pierogi and blintzes and lokshen and kasha and kugel and cholent. Can you imagine these Polonized Jewish women making cholent? No way. Or gefilte fish? No way. It's not going to happen. So the misalignment of these two early Jewish cookbooks is exquisite. Now, in addition to these two early Yiddish cookbooks, there was another one that's absolutely fascinating. It appeared, we think, first in Polish, then in Yiddish, and this would have been 1938, 1938. And it was recently published in the English translation. And it's Fania Levando, and it's it's basically, let me just see what the original Yiddish title was, because it's her Vegetarische Kochbuch, yes. Her original title is Vegetarisch Dietischer Kochbuch. Now, she is a fascinating character. And because A, she had her own restaurant, and B, she ran cooking classes. And C, she is a food person, not like Safran, not like Blaustein, not like some of these other people. She is really a food person, and and apparently literati, intellectuals, that kind of crowd, you could say rather progressive, not bourgeois so much. They patronized her restaurant and also left endorsements in a guest book. So it's a really very, very interesting case. And of course, that cookbook is scarce as can be. I would do anything to have a copy of the original Yiddish and the original Polish. So now let's turn to the United States, because if that 1896 and 1898 Yiddish cookbook from Vilna, New York was kosher gourmet, that's not what the Yiddish cookbooks look like that followed, not at all. In fact, what followed, which I think is really, really, really interesting, are I have them right here, just a second, let me just move this. What followed, first of all, what follows are people like these, they're not really hacks, but these journalists like Blaustein, like Alexander Harkavy. He would write like a Briefensteller, a letter writing, how to write letters, also dictionaries and the like. And so the Jewish Family Cookbook, which has a preface and an English supplement by Harkavy, published in 1915 by the Hebrew Publishing Company, plain covers, nothing fancy, no illustrations, and almost entirely in Yiddish. And it's called the Family Cookbook. And clearly, this cookbook, I would say, like the others that are published in the US, have rather more to do with really appealing to an immigrant reader and trying to, I would say, more about Americanization, more about bringing sort of healthy diet and those kinds of ideas to an immigrant woman. And they also include, and I have a nice example here is another vegetarian one. Vegetarianism was quite a big deal. Gesund und Speis und vegetarische Kochbuch. In other words, Health and Nutrition, a vegetarian cookbook by Mr. and Mrs. Mishulov. These guys were really enterprising because not only did they publish this cookbook, but they also had their own line of exercise equipment, like things with springs. And they also had their own line of vegetarian sort of meat substitutes like proteose and stuff like that. So this was, I have a feeling that this is connected. I would think of this as being connected to people that I would associate with the Bund, the labor movement, Yiddish speaking immigrants, and not aspiring to some kind of a bourgeois elegant cuisine. So, and there are several others. But what I want to do is I want to conclude with with two last examples, because I want to be sure we have time for some questions. And that is, first of all, in the United States, I haven't seen this in Europe, but in the United States, there are these product cookbooks, and they are really, really fascinating. They're amazing. And let me start with one of the most prolific, which was the Manischewitz Company. Tempting kosher dishes, but tampte Yiddische Meicholim. And what's marvelous about them, and it's true for Manischewitz, for Crisco, for Rokeach, for Planters peanut oil, for Wolf's Kasha, they are bilingual. They're bilingual. I am not aware of any bilingual cookbooks in Europe. The closest to bilingual would be the 1896 Yiddish cookbook that had German, Russian, and Yiddish terminology for the dishes, but otherwise they're not. So what's the message? The message This is this particular this Manischewitz one, which I think is their first one. The later ones are less ambitious. This was 1930. So in 1930, we've got that pirated Yiddish translation addressed to these Polonized Jewish women. In 1929, we've got Gastronomie Juive. 1930 in America, we've got Manischewitz. And Manischewitz, what is so astonishing is Manischewitz basically, what was Manishewitz's problem? Its problem was it's a matzah company. And what's the problem with a matzah company? You can only operate 2 weeks of the year? Your product is only good for 2 weeks of the year? No. On the contrary, why should it be? Here I have recipes for, with matzah, chocolate souffle, chocolate custard pudding, fruit pudding, corn fritters, pineapple dainty. I have matzah Eierkuchen, matzah Napoleon. I have Chremsel, which all very good. And I've got, just a second, just a moment. I have some wonderful dishes and wonderful, those crazy color photographs in these early cookbooks. So what's the presumption? Either it's kill two birds with one stone. So if the daughters are reading English, so they'll use the English part. And if the mothers don't read English but are Yiddish speakers, so this is like a kind of icon of a kind of transitional moment in American Jewish immigrant life, where I think of it as an intergenerational cookbook, that it's bilingual because it's in a way intergenerational. I can't imagine the mother and the daughter cooking at the same time from either side, but there's recipes in here for matzah tortillas, for and let me see, apple fritters, for cornflake cookies made with matzah. So clearly, this was an attempt to say, matzah is not just for Passover. You can use it all year round. But I don't think people who are really religious would be looking for ways to use matzah all year round. But and now Passover, it was the opportunity to promote a product, and but not only for Passover. Other product cookbooks like Crisco. In Crisco, when it writes its own history for a Jewish market, writes that the Jewish people have been waiting 2,000 years for Crisco. Why? Because it is the best substitute for butter or for schmaltz. And being pareve, you can use it in everything. So the Crisco cookbooks was not specifically for Pesach, but it was definitely a good example of marketing of a product that had a special appeal and value for a Jewish consumer. But the Planters peanut oil, this was really a favorite. And here it is, and you can see the family here around the Passover table. And it says, this special Passover recipe booklet contains 46 ways to better Passover cooking, baking, frying, salads, gravies, and it's presented to you with the compliments of Planters Edible Oil Company. And it says here, it's kosher LePesach, gesund, ganz Jahr. So it's kosher for Passover, but it is healthy all year round. So that's these product cookbooks. Now, finally, after I gave a talk on my collection, a colleague of mine that I've known for many years sent me a box of material that included from Helen's Kitchen. He said to me, he moved into a place in Los Angeles, and the woman passed away and left a lot of stuff in the kitchen. Was I interested? Of course, I'm interested. So I have a little fridge magnet of Ben Gurion. I have Helen's Kitchen, and I have this very strange trivet with bagels in some kind of plexi. But I also have a treasure of the first order. And what is the treasure of the first order? Well, of course, she had, of course, the Manischewitz. She had a later Manischewitz, because Manischewitz kept on bringing out different editions. She clipped the back of a box, but she had a manuscript cookbook, amazing manuscript cookbook. And what this cookbook was a collection not only just in a ring binder, not only of the recipes she wrote down, but this is a woman, she was a clipper, and she was clipping from the food columns in the Yiddish newspapers. And she was so, it didn't matter, on one spread, you've got her, with the written recipes, and you've got her with the, and she's got them on, she's also clipped other boxes from magazines. She's written on the little slips of paper. I mean, this woman was cooking. She was really cooking. Now, what I find there's two things about this that I find so absolutely fascinating. And that is that, number one, in fact, these food columns in the Yiddish press were really, really important. And one of the editors of such a food column for the Vorwärts was Frischwasser. Let me see if I've got her. Yes, I've got her here. Just a second. It was, and she was really something. And I'll show you her. So this is Regina Frischwasser. You can see she's a real balabusta. You get an idea of what she looks like. Now, what I want to know is, since she was editing, and in that photograph, you actually see her, just a second, you see her with all of these basically recipe cards, and she must be organizing them for her column. What I want to know is this. This book was published in 1946. And these women, like Helen, they're clipping all these recipes in Yiddish. I want to know why she published this in English when all this material appeared in the newspaper columns in Yiddish. And it's really vast. It's huge. It's really, you just have to wonder, where do all these recipes come from? Because I can't believe in any one woman's repertoire, there are so many recipes. So clearly she must have used other cookbooks. The other thing that I find so interesting is that this one from Helen, which is in a ring binder, it's falling to bits on cheap paper, and it's in Yiddish, and it's full of these clippings, is the opposite of the German Jewish ones. So presumably a young bride would receive as a gift a book like this with a lovely binding, and would then proceed with tabs. Everything is organized, and with a beautiful, beautiful handwriting. So the German Jewish women, and I have 3 such German Jewish women's manuscript cookbooks, and they're either, some of them are in a very inexpensive, basically notebook, but very, very beautifully written, very, very carefully written. And others are in a beautiful bound book that was made specifically for recording recipes. So the difference in, we're talking France, Poland, Germany, the United States, German Jews, French Jews, East European Jews, Yiddish in relation to the languages from which those Yiddish cookbooks were translated, and then from Yiddish to English, the bilingual cookbooks, the sort of intergenerational, this kind of transitional moment, the enterprising food companies producing gratis product cookbooks in an effort to promote their products, especially around Passover, but also Passover products all year round. So they're very, very rich. And finally, this hasn't stopped. In fact, I have here my Cholem zum Gesund mit über 100 Rezepten. So these are dishes for health with over 100 recipes, self-published by a woman in Brooklyn. And this is really, this is Malka Eisenberger, published in 1990. And then there's one in Israel, from Israel, von der Mama's Koch, from Mother's Kitchen. And clearly this one is not about vegetarianism. The Eisenberger is a vegetarian cookbook, but it is definitely strictly kosher, and probably, I would imagine, Hasidic or Haredi. It's coming from a completely different world. So it's not over. But in any event, I'll close with that. And I hope we have just a few minutes left for some questions and comments.
Well, thank you so much. This was a great talk, and we do have some questions that have come in, so I will go ahead and relay those to you.
Sure.
Rena Fisher asks whether you would comment on de Pomian's book from 1929, translated to English as The Jews of Poland, Recollections and Recipes, if you have.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting case of a non-Jew who's interested and who traveled, and it's a kind of a mixture of a travelogue and a food book. It's a kind of a combination. Actually, I have it here. I always have it in my collection. The reason I didn't include it is because it was so removed from Yiddish, and it's also a completely different genre. But it's a very good point. I'm glad that somebody knows about it. That's very, very nice.
Great. So Judy Konofsky asks when Manischewitz branched out to produce other products such as sweet wine.
It's a good. Also, I don't know. In truth, I don't know, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Kosher Fest, which is the largest Jewish kosher food fair, but only for people in the business. But there are now these digitally printed matzahs. I mean, you have no idea what we know. They're chocolate covered matzahs, and we know there are matzahs that are like gluten free and all kinds of matzahs. But the diversification, I don't know. The answer is I don't know.
Okay. So a question, are there any Ladino cookbooks to your knowledge?
Yes. Oh, yes. Well, I don't know. We'll put it this way. Sephardic cookbooks, yes. And wonderful ones. In Ladino, there must be, but I'm not aware of them.
Okay, great.
Well, I've never had so many questions I can't answer. What kind of an audience do we have here?
A question about whether people have been studying besides you. Are there people who are studying these early Jewish cookbooks?
Yes, in fact, Andras Kunner, who is a Hungarian food historian, has been doing pioneering work on these early Jewish cookbooks. His primary interest is in the Hungarian ones, and they're very, very interesting. And he got a National Jewish Book Award for his Hungarian, basically a kind of a cookbook and food history of Hungarian Jews. I think he got the award last year, and he is just about to bring out a new book, which is specifically about these early Jewish cookbooks, including the 1854 Hebrew lettered cookbook. So he's really been doing really groundbreaking, pioneering work.
A question from Jason Cohen. Do you try to cook some of the recipes, especially from the early ones?
Not really. I would say that first of all, I love to cook, so I just want to make that clear that I have a passion for cooking and I cook everything. But I would say, well, for example, my father, Oliver Sholem, he described to me golkes, and he described exactly what it was, that they were made from raw potatoes, and they were little balls, and they were boiled, and they had a very particular texture, and they were sort of grayish. Well, with potatoes, when you grate them, if you're not really fast, they tend to oxidize. And I basically wanted to make them for him, and so I went into my collection, started looking to see if I could find recipes. So I would be more likely to do that than to cook from the way that people are cooking their way through Ottolenghi. They're during the pandemic, they're doing the whole cookbook. They start at the beginning, and some of them are doing it in order, and they're cooking their whole way through the cookbook. So I wouldn't, not really. On occasion, if I'm going to make something, well, it's more, I guess I'm just more interested in the subject, but I do use them. I do use them. It just depends.
Gerald Lind writes, I have some Yiddish cookbooks and note card files of clipped recipes in Yiddish from my grandmother. Is any institution, I imagine, saving these for posterity?
Yes, absolutely. The National Yiddish Book Center would absolutely adore to have, and I would say this, that I think that these clippings and these, notes that people like, all these handwritten things, all of this, I think of as the material culture of the kitchen. And I think that the Yiddish Book Center in New Hampshire is collecting this material. And I saw that they have like a box, somebody had a box that they had all their cards in. So absolutely, it would be a real mitzvah to, and it would be a great home. So the Yiddish Book Center in New Hampshire.
Massachusetts.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Massachusetts. It's your college, and it's Massachusetts.
Right. Gerald Bronstein asks whether you have anything to say on the book 97 Orchard, an edible history of 5 immigrant families in one New York tenement.
Actually, I've never been in a situation where I'm not able to answer. This is terrible. It's terrifying. Not yet is the answer. Not yet, because it's a relatively new, isn't it? It's a relatively recent publication, right?
Yeah, it's within the last decade, maybe 6 years ago.
I guess at this stage in our lives, the last decade is recent.
You're a busy person, so.
What's it called? What's the title again?
It's called 97 Orchard.
Okay.
It looks at 5 families, not all of which are Jewish, in the Lower East Side.
Museum, right.
So Diana Scott and Joel Schechter ask whether you think that the Fanny Lawando book, the Vilna Vegetarian book, is heavy on eggs and butter because it's vegetarian for calories or nutrients, or
I'm not so sure it's about calories and nutrients. I think it's rather about adding richness to what would otherwise be a more austere, without schmaltz and without meat, but it really is heavy on butter and dairy, and very much so.
Great. So Susan Diamond asks whether you're familiar with the Jewish Manual, a cookbook by a lady.
Yes,
by Lila. Yes.
Yeah, well, that I can answer.
Okay.
Okay, 1846. It's by a lady, but the lady, in fact, is Judith, Lady Montefiore, and she is a fascinating character. And that cookbook is the earliest cookbook published in English, and it has a lot of Western Sephardic dishes in it, not Mediterranean, but Western Sephardic. So meaning Spain, Portugal, that is Jews from Spain and Portugal who actually settled in Amsterdam and London, in Antwerp, and who settled in in Europe, not so much North Africa and the Mediterranean. Oh, it's a fascinating book, and it's got a very, very interesting introduction that she's written for it as well.
So I have a question, which is whether, I know there would have been in the late 19th century treif in some of the German Jewish cookbooks in America. Do you see in cookbooks aimed towards Eastern European immigrants in the 20th century, does treif enter those cookbooks? And if so, when?
It's a good question. Generally, no. I think not, because the Jewish women that it was addressed to, these immigrant women, were particularly preoccupied with kosher, but because I think that it would have no appeal. I mean, or that it would be, I grew up in a kosher home. My mother was strictly kosher, and she grew up in a very religious home. My father, on my father's side, his mother kept absolutely kosher, but she wasn't like Shomer Shabbos. She wasn't what you'd call like religious. She worked on this on Saturday, etc. And so so in my home, I wouldn't call it like religious, because my father worked on Saturday, and but it was kosher. And what that meant was that even though we weren't, quote, orthodox, the idea of milk and meat or butter and meat was, it was not nauseating. It was just nauseating, quite apart from it being halachically treif. So it wasn't that it was treif, it was that it was nauseating. So I have a feeling that it would have no appeal. It wasn't like Aunt Babette's cookbook. I mean, these early Jewish cookbooks in America, they definitely, and I mean, Aunt Babette, which is also was very, very popular and came out in many editions, her cookbook, she says anything clean is not treif. That was her approach.
Great, thank you. So I think this will be our last question. This one just came to me, asking if you have, this is a nice way of bringing from the early cookbooks to today, if you have any thoughts on more recent books on modern Eastern European cookbooks, like the Gefilte Manifesto or
right. So, they're very interesting. First of all, there's a whole new generation of Jewish cookbook writers, chefs, food writers, critics. It's a whole new generation. I don't know if any of you took part in the Great Big Jewish Food Fest, which was an amazing event and very much millennials. So it's another whole world. And in the case of the Gefilte Manifesto, their approach is to, if you will, update traditional recipes and also to recuperate foods that have a bad reputation, so to speak, or a bad rap. Gefilte fish can either be absolutely the most exquisite, delicious, wonderful dish, or there's a younger generation that can't understand why anybody, could possibly love it. But of course, if you only had it from a jar with some gray jelly, I mean, it might be a reason. But so the Gefilte Manifesto is about updating, and but on the other hand, you also have the opposite. You have a return to what I'd call artisanal Jewish food. So the bagel is a great example. On the one hand, it is the most promiscuous food out there, rainbow bagels and pina colada bagels and whatever. And on the other hand, you have artisanal bagels, hand rolled, wood fired, etc. So I think it's actually going in both directions.
Great, well, thanks so much. Actually, related to that, I do want to give a plug. I know that Professor Rachel Gross of San Francisco State University is among us here on Zoom, and her new book, Beyond the Synagogue, has a chapter devoted to that revival.
Rachel, I know your book. Thank you for being here.
And we do have it at the library. So so we're going to close. Thank you so much. This was just really a pleasure. You were one of my heroes, and it's just really nice to be together, to learn from you on this topic where I don't think we could have learned it from anybody else. So
well, it was absolutely my pleasure. I want to thank everybody that they're not completely ausgesucht and are putting up with yet another Zoom. So delighted, really. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Great. Well, thank you, and be well, everybody. Be healthy, and wishing you all the best.
Okay. Can I save the chat before you close out? I want to just
sure.
Okay, just a second. Let's see. How do I do this? All right, I'll do it in Google Drive.
We can also send it to you.
Oh, that would be great. If you could send me the chat, that would be wonderful.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.